My name is Marie Venner, and the presentation I'll be doing today, and this is unmute to start speaking, Juan Pablo, but I should just use the phone audio, right?
Yep, you're good. We can hear you.
All right. So, we've heard about a number of different state situations, and I thought it might be interesting for folks to consider with us, and I'm very interested in your own strategizing about, when we have a trifecta, when we have good legislation, and we're still not getting to our goals, what's going on and what can we do next? So this is kind of a summary slide right at the start. And just so the story is a little bit easier to follow, I wanted to let you all know that, in the last 6 or 7 years, for instance, with the Polis administration, we have had a trifecta. We've negotiated what we were told was a top 4 climate law in the country, but yet we have the situation of our executive branch aiming to increase fossil fuel production by 30% this decade. How is this happening? That we say we're, pursuing compliance with the climate law, but we're actually not. We're vastly undercounting methane, ignoring legislation or overturning legislation by rulemaking, pushing off coal plant closures this decade to closer to 2030. So that's how some of this is happening, basically. All right. Okay, so where have we been? I'm providing a lot of links in this presentation. So Colorado actually started in a pretty good place. We had one of the first
Sorry, 1 second, Marie.
renewable.
We're not seeing your slides. So if you could
Oh,
just share them again, then we'll be good to go.
yeah, let's try to share again. Okay, sorry. All right.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. Now we can't hear you though.
You're muted.
You unmute your phone. You just unmute your phone the way we had it before. We should be good.
Unmute phone. All right, got it?
Perfect.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So I've already mentioned some of the elements in how we find ourselves, bypassing 2020 and 2025 requirements in GHG objectives in law. Where have we been? We started out with this renewable portfolio standard, lots of resistance from the utilities saying it's impossible. Even before XCel built one of the largest coal plants in the country, that's in Pueblo, having, some pretty big impacts on the Latinx community next door. Even as far back as 2009 and using the utilities' own data, renewables were and would be cheaper, but they lobbied for coal. They get fully reimbursed for maintenance and downtime and even early phase out of their equipment. So if it doesn't work, it's still financially beneficial for them, maybe even more financially beneficial. So that's the situation that we found ourselves in, and I've attached a couple other resources if you want to go into that. So meet our governor. He'd like to run for president someday. He has a phenomenal PR team, so he appears nationally quite a bit. He doesn't want to alienate fossil fuel or Wall Street interests, including IOUs. So you might ask yourself, what sort of risks would you take for that? and we'll shortly see. This is one of the most impactful climate images that I've seen and that I've used in presentations. So this is just one unconscionable consequence. I come from a farm family on one side, roots in the Midwest. And what we were warned about in 2014 and 2015 is the risk of multi-decadal mega droughts. So these are 20 to 30 year plus mega droughts. In 2015, we were warned that, we had a 12% risk of this century. And this is gigantic. So think of the pictures from the Dust Bowl, because that's what they were measuring here is soil moisture loss. I think probably everyone on this call knows about the physics of that. So even, as we get to higher temperature, higher moisture levels in the atmosphere, think of the clothes dryer at your house. So high humidity in the clothes dryer, drying out the clothes, which is basically our land. Except we're running this experiment on our world, not within an enclosed space. And now, even with low, medium, and high emission scenarios, all of those are over 50%. So this is a gigantic risk. You can see Colorado is the deepest brown. We're right in the bullseye. And also we see a lot of suffering really already further south in Central America. And that has a lot to do with the immigration we're seeing. So fossil fuels and getting off of them are the issue. I'm assuming everyone on this call has probably seen the curve really that we needed to meet with fossil fuel cuts in order to get to 1.5C. On the right, you'll see some research by Susan Solomon when she was at NCAR in Colorado. And these are the years, right? So 2000 and 2100. Look at the middle graph and you can see that the global average warming pretty much stays wherever we stop using fossil fuels. That's what the graphic is here. So it's enormously consequential when and where we stop, and it stays at pretty much that same temperature level for millennia. So that's another graphical depiction of what we were already hearing from NASA in 2015. And there's a clear answer, for this absolutely dire situation for Colorado. Agriculture and recreation are two of our biggest industries out here. The fossil fuel industry actually employs 0.7%, and that includes a lot of the associated jobs. Their average is a little bit higher than average, but still under 2% in terms of the income generated. Even back in 2020, GridLab confirmed that closing coal by 2025 was the most responsible and most cost-effective path for electricity in Colorado and the best way to meet those legal targets. And by ignoring this, we are literally playing with fire. So, you might think of, well, hey, clean air in the mountains, and that would be kind of to the left of the image that you're seeing here. But for instance, in the county that we live in, outlined in gray there, 67% of all properties have some risk of being affected by wildfire over the next 30 years. And air pollution is just the fossil fuel air pollution is responsible for 1 in 5 deaths worldwide, research doctors have told us now, and it contributes to inflammation affecting every organ and every cell, and thus every physical and mental condition. There has just been an avalanche of research this last last decade, so the teens about this, and there's more links there. Metro Denver has some of the worst air pollution in the country. Of course, you're seeing particulate pollution here, but actually the ozone pollution from the ozone precursors with fracking and with automobile pollution are our biggest problem in Colorado. And that ozone pollution is, pretty invisible, and it extends along Front Range. So we've been hugely out of compliance in that area for a long time, and not making progress on ozone. XCel's gas plants in the metro area disproportionately impact Latinx communities. Our electricity is mainly brought up from Pueblo, where it's impacting those communities with coal plants. And XCel wants to build more of these plants and run them far past the goals of our local communities. The thing to keep in mind is that we have alternatives, and I'll get into some of those. We have made legislative progress again and again. Colorado passed in the last couple of years the ability or prohibiting XCel from charging their lobbying to customers. Transportation spending is another thing that needs to change, and it's a very similar pattern of delay, right? So, we have good initiatives. We hear a lot about those initiatives. It's very obscure to the public, even to experts sometimes, how much of that is being applied to the whole. And that's really the biggest problem. I would say the two biggest problems, right? So, there may be a climate program or a multimodal program, but that's a very small percentage of the whole. The other thing is making changes to the planning process, but they don't apply until the next 10-year plan. Certainly after the current STIPs, state transportation improvement programs, which are 4 years. And also, these sort of plans are just rolled over every 2 years. So you have really fairly ancient, 15 to 20-year-old project plans that just keep getting rolled over. A good example that we can all point to and use is the recent settlement of our Children's Trust with the Hawaii Department of Transportation, which required build out of pedestrian and bike networks, right, that connect, that are safe, like our road networks. And that's required in 5 years, not by 2020, 2045 or 2050, like a lot of our plans are in Colorado and elsewhere. All right, I was just telling you about this. Show us the sort of dashboard that we want to see, like where is the whole DOT budget going, right? Not just kind of the more obscure categories or their redefinition of equity, like equity among their districts, not equity among people. We can also make best use of our public resources, from land to budgets. And at this point, I'd just like to take kind of a big picture pause, and also we'll pass along some other slides I'd welcome anyone to use. We've known about these problems for decades and centuries. A way we can think about this and take a closer look at what's going on is look at who's been suffering and who's been profiting or doing well by that. So we know the investor-owned utility, and those, they're Wall Street investors. They've been able to profit. The fossil fuel industry's been able to profit. The top 1% has been able to profit. Many communities have been directly impacted, and actually all of us are suffering from this pollution. How have the oversight entities gotten away with this? After a whole career of doing research for the National Academies and all state agencies, through their cooperative and strategic research programs, best practices, and then the last 10 years very focused on Colorado policy. It's just not a fortunate story for sure. It's, political power, money, access, and influence, despite a trifecta, despite legislation. So, and something that we're really working on now, the secretiveness regarding the data and models, the lack of public interest planning. Instead, we have a system that is highly secretive, and that facilitates extracting over $750 million from Colorado every year. So it's time to do something different, and these plans can change. I'm mainly showing you these next couple slides so you can have them yourselves, and the links. Scientists have been tracking climate change since the 1800s. It's been in the news, our leading newspapers since the 1880s. It's been in smaller newspapers since then. And by the 1950s, government and industry have been following CO2 and the temperature rise. There was a whole of government report on this in the mid 60s. Then the fossil fuel industry did their own counter research and report. And basically, there were about 200 academic papers at that point, and they responded basically and agreed on the scientific consensus on climate change. So again, this is back in the 60s. And now we know, this is news from this year, the last 6 months, over 100 hearings examining CO2 and the greenhouse effect occurred even before adoption of the Clean Air Act. So, contrasting that with our situation today, what we saw the 80s, 90s, and 2000s were, fossil fuel industry retrenchment, pursuing a strategy very similar to tobacco, often involving some of the same PR experts, and putting it back on our responsibility, right? BP came up with a carbon footprint approach. So it is possible to get this done. It's not there are some simple takeaways, and I'm going to highlight those today. And one of them is, if you're in a hole, of course, stop digging, right? We have to stop doing some of the same things, rolling over the same strategies, or postponing a different approach until after the current decade. We did that last decade, we're doing that this decade. Some of those things are existing fossil fuel sources of energy indeed must be phased out, and rapidly, not next decade or closer to the 2030s or something. Of course, we need to replace our fossil fuel energy with solar, wind, and battery powered electricity. And as we make any new investment needs to be electric, and government helping with this. We have some of that with the IRA, but definitely not as much as we could or want to see, taking seriously the narrower term decade or deadlines. Like 2025 in Colorado, obviously now that's next year, but we could make another one that was, let's say, 2026. A little bit more on Colorado. Colorado was supposedly one of 4 states with the top climate regulations, GHG reductions by deadline, 26% reduction by 2025. The state was supposed to draft implementing regulations that would then be approved by a panel of Polis appointees. A guy from Chevron was the lead for that during most of the Polis administration. But the administration staff actually refused to support or develop the implementing regulations, and we heard endless excuses about that from the executives. The legislature even provided plenty of new full-time employees, very unusual in Colorado, to draft those implementing regulations, but that didn't happen. Instead, we've had over 7,000 new permits under Polis, not one turned down due to health and safety, and just a lot of delay. In fact, in the first year and a half of the Polis administration, over 3,000 fracking permits were issued, and we have experienced ongoing problems with just plentiful exemptions to the 2,000-foot setback. But maybe the biggest contradiction was increasing oil and gas production by 30% this decade. The roadmap does call for some good ideas. I've mentioned here in italics some of the way they have kind of circumvented even those, shifting off coal for renewables, but kicking the can down the road to 2030, reducing methane pollution, but it still lets oil and gas self-report. They found out and even acknowledged now that these are vast underestimates. We could be making a faster shift to electric vehicles, disallowing continued development of houses on gas, cutting methane emissions. So these are some of the details about how the Polis administration managed to avoid the strong public call for action to reduce pollution by 26% by 2025. For a long time, they avoided ever mentioning or acknowledging that in any of the Air Quality Control Commission meetings. They tried to get everyone to wait for the GHG roadmap, but then when it came out, it promoted more oil and gas. They kept pointing to old and existing regulations, and Polis's MO has really been voluntary approaches. So, especially now in the 2020s, I think it's really valuable for us to be aware of the discourses of delay, redirecting responsibility, redirecting the whole conversation to talk about existing programs that, as the Polis administration did, instead of changes that might need to be made or what would be under the purview of the AQCC, even pushing false solutions like nuclear and hydrogen, or non-transformative solutions, just very small regulatory adjustments, or continuing with the voluntary programs. But there's a lot that we can still do now. We can not abandon near-term reduction goals. Get ready for coal to be a small part of the picture. This is still provided by the private sector, and it's becoming less and less profitable for them to do it. We can implement public banking to make some of these investments that we need to make on the state level and retake ownership of the utilities, so the profits that are generated are not going to Wall Street, they're staying in state for more investment. We can enable solar on all parking lots, basically reduce some of the locational warming that we have due to all that pavement, and turning that into an asset for us, and getting workers what they need instead of Wall Street. We can make our next vehicle electric. It's cheaper. There's a lot of benefits to that. Indeed, in the West, often our house is on fire. And of course, climate change relates to many justice areas. I showed you that picture of, and we can begin to address climate homicide. So there's a link to that here. Granted, we are figuring out a huge problem, but one thing that should help us is Americans agree on money and politics, and money in politics. The very highest levels of trust are to small business, right? The very lowest levels of trust are to big business, and Congress's basically vulnerability to that. So the wide agreement on that should be a positive. Could that lead us to another HB1 or SB1 in 2025? So that's pretty much it. This is an extraordinarily candid presentation of what's been going on in Colorado, and I'm very interested in people's questions and strategies. for what we might do going forward.